You know what time it is. It's another Escape from Tarkov wipe, which means another Escape from Tarkov settings guide. Now, this is not your typical Escape from Tarkov settings guide. If you haven't watched mine before, I try to walk you through each setting and explain to you what it does and showcase it to you so that you have a better idea of not only how to set it for whatever you prefer visually, but also so that you know how to set it for maximum performance. There is not a one-size-fits-all setting configuration for Tarkov. In fact, it's very system specific and depends on if you are GPU bottlenecked or CPU bottlenecked in a given scenario. If I remember to, and if I don't, you can yell at me, but I'll post a quick explanation of GPU and CPU bottlenecked, along with a link to a tutorial where I showcase how to show that, so you can get a better idea of how to follow this guide. If you have any questions about the video as you go through, feel free to leave them either in the comments or in my Discord. The Discord is pinned in the description and it'll also be in the pinned comment as well. It's a great place for you to ask questions not only to me, but to the other 1,500 members and growing in that Discord so you can get a better idea of how to improve your performance. If you'd rather just ask me, there's always my live streams, which I tend to do on Fridays at 6:30 p.m. CST and on Sundays at 1:30 p.m. CST. The schedule is a little bit off because of the recent wipe, but I'll make sure to get back on that soon. Anyway, I'm not going to waste any more of your time. Without further ado, let's get straight into the settings. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us into a offline Streets of Tarkov raid, because that will give us just something, a nice little playground to mess around with settings on. And then I also have a bunch of different comparison shots that we'll be able to look at, and I'll point out some of the differences as we go along. All right, so I just got to the area I wanted to be for my Streets raid. Generally, I tend to benchmark over by that ruined car, but for the sake of the video, I figured we'd be next to some more objects so I could showcase some things in more detail. Let's dive into the settings tab though. Obviously in the game settings, I know there's a couple things we got to cover first. There's automatic RAM cleaner, and there's also only use physical cores. I've made a whole video series at this point about automatic RAM cleaner and VRAM spillover and everything like that, so I may revamp that for this wipe. It's obviously going to take me a long time to do that though. Basically what it does is whenever you have it checked, it will actually reduce the amount of RAM you are starting with at the beginning of a raid, along with whenever you hit escape, clearing out your RAM. It will make your game freeze whenever you hit escape temporarily though, or whenever you enter this menu. So for example, when I check automatic RAM cleaner here, you will see that my game will freeze and then it will clear RAM. You can see in my overlay, which is from CapFrameX by the way, that my in-use RAM went down significantly, and of course my total allocated RAM is going down steadily as well. This can be really nice if you're struggling to keep under your RAM limit, but as long as you have the right texture quality, those of you who are at, say, 32 gigabytes of RAM shouldn't need to use automatic RAM cleaner. And we'll get to texture quality in a second. For those of you who have run automatic RAM cleaner though and have noticed some more stuttering, you can always leave it off, and then whenever you feel like you need to clear out your RAM, you can just check it and then save it like I just did, and it will clear out RAM. And then you can just go back and then uncheck it like I just did there, and then be good. This will probably save you from having to do that restart every couple of raids tactic that I've seen a lot of people doing around the internet. But yeah, for those of you 16 gigs and under, I would definitely recommend automatic RAM cleaner. Otherwise, you should be good to generally avoid it as long as your settings are correct. Only use physical cores basically disables hyperthreading for the game. It's one of those settings where it's very CPU specific on if this is going to benefit you or not. And as a whole, I believe that there are better alternatives than using this setting. If you didn't know about hyperthreading, long story short, most CPUs nowadays use hyperthreading to where, for example, if I load up my task manager, you'll see that my CPU, even though it's listed as an 8-core processor, has 16 boxes here in my performance tab. These are showing the logical processors or threads of my CPU. Each core gets 2, and you can basically think of it as having an extra mouth that feeds the CPU stuff to chew on, essentially. This can be great for productivity workloads, but for gaming it can be hit or miss. It heavily depends again on what CPU you're running, and it's something that each individual is going to just have to test on their own. Like I said though, there are better alternatives than just disabling it in the game. For those of you who want to test it, you could always use Process Lasso and disable hyperthreading that way, but You can also, if you're trying to overclock things, disable hyperthreading entirely and go for a crazy overclock like some high-end 14th gen users do. You can always run a RAID with it on, run a RAID with it off, or run some offline tests like I do to see if you can find any noticeable performance impact, Anyway, moving over to graphics, obviously this is the tab that everybody wants to see, so let's get right to it. We'll get rid of the boring ones first. Screen res should be the resolution of your monitor. That's pretty self-explanatory. Aspect ratio is personal preference, but if you run 4:3, you are kind of a freak. Screen mode, technically full screen is the best for latency, as long as it's exclusive full screen, though having full screen does make tabbing out a bit more of a pain in the ass, depending on how you have things set up and if you've done the disable full screen optimizations, tweak, quote unquote, and stuff like that. To make it simple though, full screen is ideal, but if you tab out a lot, don't feel too bad in running borderless. Monitor is also quite self-explanatory. You should set this to your preferred monitor. Now, next on the list is texture quality. Obviously, now we're getting to the real things. Typically, when I was comparing texture quality, I'd just be in game and not have a way to show you, but why did they add that to offline? But now I do have a way to show you guys it. I've taken screenshots and I have this wonderful handy dandy tool called Nvidia iCat that I can use to showcase these screenshots to you. I spent way more time than I'm willing to admit, honestly, gathering some screenshots to showcase. So for example, with texture quality, let me showcase these to you right now. I will be using this tool quite a lot during this video, so to basically explain how it goes, you'll see the names of each of my screenshots down below, which will indicate which setting is being applied. For example, this is the low texture screenshot right here, this is the medium, and this is the high. It could also be like this split screen, to where if I wanted to show you the difference between, say, low and medium textures, I can move this back and forth to show you that difference. Again, you will see which is which based on the names of the screenshots in the bottom. I know it's kind of hard to read though, so I will try to point it out when possible if we have like any mobile watchers or anything like that. Anyway, going to the side-by-side with low on the left, medium in the middle, and high on the right, you'll see that in the new factory, the clearest difference is on the hands. I mean, it's night and day pretty much. Low is definitely the mushiest, medium is a pretty good middle ground, and high is obviously the clearest. However, this is something that I haven't really seen previously. I did not realize this difference was so stark. Another thing that sort of struck me as odd is that the high textures simply feel clearer at a distance. If you look at this box, for instance, the edges feel sharper on the textures on this box and everything, and on the rebar up here. It looks better at a distance with these higher quality textures, in my opinion. Also, obviously closer up, as you can see, for example, on this trash bin right here, the low textures look muddy in comparison to medium, and medium also likewise looks muddy in comparison to high. This setting, as I mentioned previously, will affect your VRAM and your RAM usage, especially if you're getting VRAM spillover. If you're one of those people who say has 16 gigs of RAM and maybe a lower end GPU that has say 6 gigabytes of VRAM or something, you may have to run low texture quality in order to get by and reduce your stuttering. For me though, since I'm on a 3070 Ti, which is an 8 gigabyte card, I can normally squeeze by using medium texture quality, even at 1440p. I would recommend anybody who has a 12 gigabyte GPU and up, honestly, to go with high. If you have a 10 gigabyte card, you could also try high, but just be wary of your VRAM consumption. It can get a little rough sometimes. If you're noticing really bad performance instability and you're not sure where exactly it's coming from, try lowering your texture quality and seeing if that smooths out. If it does, then you are probably running into some VRAM or RAM concerns regarding capacity. The performance impact will come if you run out of VRAM. That's when you really will feel that hit. If you're worried about your VRAM, you can always find that in your MSI Afterburner overlay if you set that up with this video, which I will link below. If you have any other performance overlay or hardware info or stuff like that, you can see it in there too. You can also see VRAM consumption in Task Manager in the Performance tab when you click on your graphics card and look at dedicated GPU memory, but I wouldn't go for this all the time, as I don't like using Task Manager as it can be inaccurate for Tarkov sometimes. But to summarize, low texture quality should be reserved if you're really running into major concerns and have a more lower-end build with 16 gigs of RAM and a lower-end GPU that has 6 gigs or less. Most 8 gig GPUs should be fine at medium textures, and then if you can go past that, then you could try high at that point. Also, if you have problems with textures specifically on streets, you could try to enable Streets of Tarkov lower texture resolution mode, which you can find at the bottom right here. Based on previous testing, This setting basically lowers your texture quality by a notch. So, for example, if you have medium texture quality set like I do, it means that every map will run at medium textures except for streets. Likewise, if I was running high textures here, then every map would have high texture quality except for streets, where it would be medium. That can help if streets is really the thing that's killing your performance as far as VRAM and RAM consumption is concerned, but you don't want to lose those higher quality textures on other maps. Next on the list is shadows quality. This is actually something that's new to this settings guide that I haven't been able to really showcase properly before. The new factory rework has given me shadows that never change because the time of factory never changes. And so because of that, if I go back in here and upload these right here, I can get side-by-side comparisons for the shadows really easily. Now, what does shadow quality do? Well, it looks like there's sort of two branches to shadow quality. Low and medium look fairly similar, and high and ultra also look fairly similar. High and ultra have much more defined shadows that match the shape of objects a lot more clearly, whereas low and medium shadows sort of are just softer blobs of shadows that sort of match the shape, but tend to lose the overall image of whatever they're casting shadows from. Another difference is up here towards this. I have no idea what this is, but you can clearly see these extra shadows are way more visible. Like these thinner shadows are basically lost on the lower quality shadows. Wow. Whereas on the higher quality shadows, these thinner ones are way more obvious and easier to spot. How important that is to you is obviously to your personal preference, but one thing is clear. The real only options you should be covering here are high and low. It doesn't look like medium offers anything to improve on the shadow quality from low, at least not that I can see, and ultra doesn't seem to have any big benefit over high either. Maybe some slight clarity buffs to the textures on the shadows and how clear they are, but not by much. So if you like having a bit more realistic shadows that match objects a bit more clearly, even if they're a little bit darker, you should run high shadows. Keep in mind though that obviously if you're GPU bottlenecked, those shadows will decrease your performance. And by GPU bottlenecked, I mean, like you can see here with my GPU usage being at 100% in the top right, or left, jeez, sorry. If you're not GPU bottlenecked though, then shadow quality doesn't really have an effect. Then you could have these higher quality shadows, which in my opinion look fantastic. If you don't care for this though, or would rather shadows just be lighter in general, then it seems like low is the way to go, as that gives the lightest shadows not really much of a difference from medium, but they're blurrier, and even though they're blurrier, they are softer, meaning that they're not as dark, which can be a blessing and a curse, I suppose. So for people who are GPU bottlenecked, low is the best for performance, but if you have performance to spare, or if you are not GPU bottlenecked, you might be able to run high with no compromises whatsoever. I would not go up to ultra, however, and medium does not seem to be a happy medium in between low and high at all, so I would honestly ignore it. Next on the chopping block is object LOD quality. If you didn't know, LOD stands for level of detail, and that basically controls the level of detail at a certain distance. So the higher you set it, the higher distance away objects will be set to their lower quality counterparts to try and improve performance. For example, you can see that tree in the distance, which you can barely see over my stupid Uzi iron sight, is a lower quality than some of the trees that are closer by. If I bump up my object LOD quality to its maximum instead, that tree will become a higher quality model. However, as you might have seen, it does impact performance slightly for both GPU and CPU bound individuals. It's because of that I like to strike a good mix between the visual fidelity and the performance here. 2.5 is what I normally set to. And then if I need a bit more, I go up to 3 if poppin is bothering me a bit too much. Because I should have mentioned that it not only controls the quality of that, but can also control when some clutter spawns in or things like that on the ground. Some people don't like how that looks though and want to make sure that the LOD is as high as possible at as far of a distance as possible, so they tend to crank this up a bit more. Keep in mind though that this is one of the few settings that actually does impact your CPU bound FPS in Escape from Tarkov, so I would try to set this to as low of a possible value as you're okay with. And for me, that's 2.5. To showcase what the difference might be, I got some of these screenshots from Wood so you can get an idea of the maximum and minimum difference you can have. So here I'm going to set object LOD quality 4 on the right and object LOD quality 2 on the left here. This is currently Object LOD Quality 2, and as you can see in the distance, there is a lot of lower quality trees. Not to mention, closer by, these objects seem to have lost a good bit of their detail. When I swipe by and add it to Object LOD Quality 4, you can see that a lot more of the objects are a higher quality. These logs are more 3D, there's more 3D logs over here as well that weren't previously, as you can see. And not to mention, the skyline drastically improves by setting it to that higher LOD quality. Basically here you have to find something that's a good mix for you between quality and performance. For me, that's 2.5. As you can see, some trees were added back with 2.5 here, but you will have to find that line yourself. There's only maybe a 5% difference in performance at max with this setting on either way, minimum or maximum. So if that's fine for you to sacrifice, you could run it at max, but just be warned that that is one of the few ways you could boost your performance if you were CPU bottlenecked, at least with in-game settings. Next, we have overall visibility. This can go in here from 400 to 3,000 meters, which I believe is the metric for this, and it determines how far away objects start to disappear in the distance. A place that I always tend to call this out on is on woods, because if you look over the big lake here, it's super easy to spot what pops in and pops out. So you can see when I go from 4,000 to 1,000 for the overall visibility setting, there's something that just pops up in the distance that was not there before. If this pop-in is annoying for you, and it is just a pop-in by the way, there is no gradient for this, and if that does annoy you, then feel free to turn this up, as the performance difference I could see was like nothing. It was run-to-run variance levels of change, so I wouldn't be concerned with this. My personal preference is 1500 because, as you can see, there was a crane that popped into existence right here that was not there previously. You tend to not really see many things that are more than 1500 meters away, so that's why I tend to keep it around there. If you'd like to set it higher though, that's completely up to you. Next, we have a new setting, which is cloud quality. This actually doesn't have much of an impact on performance that I can see, regardless of if your GPU or CPU bottlenecked, so it's a good place to actually crank something up. I went to a nighttime streets raid, which I figured would give some nice cloud quality comparisons, and it did. If you can spot the difference here, that's good, but if you can't, let me show you real quick. Basically, as you up cloud quality, you can see that the resolution and the gradients in between where clouds get thinner and thicker is more smoothed out. It's actually way easier to see on high here. You can see on high that these blocky sort of pixely clouds are sort of smoothed out and there's much more of a gradient in between each color. I think this looks really good. And I mean, I don't know really why they did this, as it doesn't really have an effect yet, but maybe it will in the future. For now though, I think you should be fine to run this at high, as I wasn't able to make a performance impact occur with this setting at all. Next on the ballot is anti-aliasing. If you didn't know, anti-aliasing basically reduces the amount of jagged edges or aliasing that you see on objects. So for example, if I turn this to off, you're going to see the horror show that is the pixelation on objects, especially the wires here. I think it's quite clear as day that that is extremely gross. I do have some screenshots though to showcase that in a bit more of a easier way to understand. So let's look here. You can see that aliasing happening right up here. You can see how each pixel is basically not blended at all with the background. It's quite stark contrast, which can make it look blocky and jagged, hence the name jagged edges. This is why a lot of people, including myself, liked running either TAA or TAA high, depending on if their GPU bottlenecked or not. You can see that once I enable TAA, a lot of things are smoothed out, and also at the same time it's a bit more blurry. And that's sort of the trade-off we have to make with the current anti-aliasing solutions in Tarkov. It's either a bit clearer but more pixely in nature, or slightly less clear but a lot less pixely and distracting. You can see that like overall the sharpness of how this looks is decreased. It's way more blended together, and that's TAA in action. TAA is temporal anti-aliasing, so it's taking data from multiple frames and blending it together to reduce the aliasing. There is also FXAA, but to me, this looks more cluttered than TAA is, and it doesn't actually help with the clarity of the image much. You can see like this here, inside the windows, it's less smooth there, and also on these wires, it just completely fails the reconstruction of them. I mean, this is just, it's just bad. It's just really, really bad. So I really can't recommend FXAA that much, but hey, if you like it, it's your cup of tea. I would personally recommend, if you want the most clarity, to run it off. And if you'd like the least amount of shimmering possible, run TAA high. TAA high has somewhat of a noticeable GPU bound performance impact, but even I run it on my GPU bound system just because that shimmering can get very, very annoying. If Tarkov added DLAA, which is basically DLSS, which we'll get to in a second, but at native resolution, a lot of these problems would go away. So I'm begging, please add DLAA to Escape from Tarkov. Speaking of DLSS, let's talk about that with FSR. DLSS is exclusive to the RTX 20, 30, and 40 series GPUs, so if you don't have that, you're going to have to either use FSR 2.2 or FSR 3.0. All of these, however, are upscalers, meaning that basically they run the game at a lower than native resolution, a percentage of it. So for example, quality on any of these is at 66% of the native resolution. And then they try to upscale it to make it look like its native resolution. There is a difference in how these present themselves though, and since FSR 3.0 is new, I figured I'd talk about that briefly. Let's look at native in comparison to DLSS quality and FSR 3 quality. There we go. I want to quickly check first FSR versus native. One thing I want you to notice that as I scroll between native on the left here and FSR 3 on the right, is that it seems to be getting sharper, at least on first glance. And you would be correct in saying that. It is actually looking a bit sharper. Even when I go into game and enable FSR 3 on quality, you will see that it still seems pretty damn sharp, and with YouTube compression, it's probably really hard to tell. The issue though is in the stability of the image. Just to exemplify it so it comes through YouTube compression, I'm going to go down to balanced just to have it showcased a bit more in game. But you can see that, for example, on some of the wiring, there is just huge amounts of flickering, especially in the smoke right there, and it can't quite reconstruct it correctly. That flickering is exemplified, and because it's sort of got this over sharpened look for it, which you could tune obviously, but because it has that over sharpened look, it just tends to shimmer a lot, even in places where it should be able to reconstruct properly. So don't be fooled by the over sharpened nature of this image. It isn't better. In fact, I think it's a little bit worse, as it can be a lot more unstable and distracting, especially if you're playing at lower resolutions and still trying to use the upscale. In the meantime, if you have access to it, DLSS kind of does the opposite, where if I go to roughly the same place again and showcase this, the image actually gets a little bit softer when DLSS gets applied to it. It's not by much, but you can see, for example, on these panels up here that were spotty and sort of weird with how the pixels were displayed, they're much more linear again, and they're reconstructed in a better sense. The same thing with this here. If I go between native and DLSS, you'll see that these lines on these crates get a lot more, well, defined with DLSS. That's why I tend to prefer DLSS. I mean, I have access to it, so I feel like that's a bit of a biased opinion, but that's why I prefer DLSS, is because the reconstruction doesn't have to rely on that sharpness, and in fact, the anti-aliasing that it provides is sometimes superior to even TAA. However, it is still an upscaler, so if you're not GPU bound, you're basically reducing the resolution for not any performance impact. It's just for the visual sake. There is DLDSR in combination with DLSS, which is basically the inverse of DLSS, but I won't get you confused with that for now. I have a video about that, which I can link in the description. Long story short though, with the settings that are in-game, DLSS does look quite nice, but you'll have a lower resolution, so objects in the distance may not be as clear or as easy to spot for you, especially if you're upscaling from 1080p and not 1440p like me. If you had to run one though to improve image quality, I would have to choose DLSS. If you're trying to improve performance with it, you have to be GPU bound like I am here. You can see right here that I am GPU bound even with DLSS quality. So when I go to remove DLSS quality and just go back to my native presentation, my FPS is going to tank. It went from 144 to about 108. And that's because I was GPU bottlenecked in this scenario, and so I get a performance boost from this upscaling. With all that in mind, let me sum it up. If you are GPU bottlenecked, you can get a performance boost from upscaling. And if you're not, I would try to steer clear of upscaling. However, the presentation of DLSS in terms of image stability is pretty good. So if you were at a higher resolution and wanted to use DLSS to try and get a more stable image with the quality setting, even though it's still a lower internal resolution, it can look pretty good. If you're not on a 20, 30, or 40 series card though, I would stick to FSR 3.0 and again, stick to as high of a quality setting as you can. If you're trying to improve performance with it, then obviously you still want to do that. Just make sure that while you're improving performance, you don't go too crazy and say, I don't know, to be extreme, FSR 3.0 at ultra performance, because you're going to hit a point where you're not at 100% GPU usage anymore, and you are basically running at an even lower resolution for nothing. You can see that between ultra performance and performance, I'm still not hitting that 100% usage threshold, and my FPS is going to stay the same. With that, we go to resampling, which we're going to skip over because you should never use this unless you have a 4090. I'm just going to be honest. You probably don't have the headroom to actually use it, and if you did, you should probably use DLSS or VSR instead if you're on an AMD GPU. The next setting is HBAO, or Horizon-Based Ambient Occlusion. Long story short, this controls the shadows you see around some objects, and, for example, around where my gun touches the hand here. You can see when I disable HBAO, all of that light shadowing, that detail shadowing is gone from my grip. Likewise, you can see it on some of the terrain too. Here I have HBAO off on the left, and then HBAO max performance sliding in from the right. And you can see for these trash bags, for example, on this wall, adding a little bit of HBAO adds some depth to the image. And instead of having the trash bags be flat with no shadowing whatsoever, it adds that little bit of detail shadowing, which makes it look like it's in the environment a bit more. The higher you go with the setting, the darker these shadows get until you hit colored ultra. Ultra tends to have a bit more definition too. It's not quite as dark as high, it has a bit more definition here, but colored ultra really sets itself apart here. And sort of looks like HBAO max performance, but done in a more resource intensive way. It also looks quite good. If you have the GPU headroom, you could totally, oh my god, that BTR, I swear. Anyway, even though I'm GPU bound, I still like running max performance, as this setting only affects GPU bound performance. So even though I'm a GPU bound player, having this just, I think, makes the game look so much nicer. I mean, look at the gun in my hands between max performance and off. I mean, it just looks so much more defined and real, and the way it sits in the hand with a little bit of shadowing on the gun, it just looks way nicer. So if you're GPU bound, I would recommend at least running max performance, as I love how this looks. Ideally for performance, you'd want to run it off with GPU bound users, but I mean, it just looks so much better in comparison. Otherwise, if you have something like a 4090 and plenty of headroom to spare, colored ultra looks phenomenal. It is a little bit dark for my taste, but still, I think it looks great. And if you want that cinematic aspect of Tarkov, I think that's the setting for you right there. Next up on the chopping block is SSR, and this goes from left to right with lowest to highest quality, starting with off. And you can clearly see once you hit SSR on low, this is in a raining scenario, so you can see there's puddles on the ground there. And as you go up, those puddles tend to get more image fidelity. If I zoom into these puddles here, you can sort of see that the bus is starting to be defined more as you go up in quality. However, something that I noticed in my testing is that in areas that have large bodies of water, SSR on the lower settings, which is what I previously would recommend, looks really bad. You can see here on SSR off, this looks fairly normal. But the second I set to SSR low instead, when I drag that in here, you're gonna see the comparison is it's quite bad. It just, the quality of this is just awful. And even when you go to Ultra SSR, and I set that to Ultra, it just doesn't, it still just doesn't look good in my opinion. So it's hard for me to say what I'd recommend here. If you don't mind this can be, a pretty good setting to have those puddles and stuff in your raids, but this can be annoying if you play a lot of maps that are close to water, like woods, shoreline, lighthouse. It can be kind of distracting. But that's also not the whole story, because there's been a rumor in the Tarkov community for, a long time about SSR improving your ability to see in dark areas. So I took it upon myself to test that as well. So you can see here with SSR off, this is the hallway. It's quite dark, and I shot out this light. It's the new factory rework, just to try to make it as dark as possible. And since this is one of the hallways that people tend to cite as improving visibility with SSR, I decided to find out in the new rework if that was still the case. Long story short, and it's kind of hard to see, so I'll go back and forth as I talk, they're kind of right. So this is off, and this is low. And you can see when I go to low, like I'm at right now, it is actually a little bit brighter. It's quite clear actually that it is brighter, especially at the distance there. It's quite night and day. So if you want the best competitive edge, then you would probably want to have low at least. Setting this any higher to say ultra, which I still tested, didn't really offer any sort of improvement over low. So let me put low on this side. This is low, ultra, low, ultra. Nothing really. Not to mention, if you're GPU bound, setting this higher and higher will significantly impact your performance, so I wouldn't recommend going too far into the SSR rabbit hole. Regardless, if you want that tactical advantage, you could run low. But if that water is distracting to you, and if you're GPU bound and want the best performance, you could set it to off, but obviously you have it be a bit darker. Now, after SSR, we have anisotropic filtering. Typically, if you didn't have anisotropic filtering enabled, which I normally have mine forced on, but if you didn't have it enabled and had it set to off, the game would look something like this with textures that were not directly displayed straight to you. As they got further away, they would get drastically worse in quality until you enabled anisotropic filtering. Again, this is a setting that only would affect GPU-bound performance, and per texture was the preferred setting for those who were GPU-bound. Otherwise, you could force it on, and even though that's more intensive, you'd get a better result. The issue is that I can't find a difference anymore. When I have it displayed correctly, I can't see the difference. Previously, I went to my Nvidia control panel and forced a 16x anisotropic filtering to the game to force it to be that, but I've since reset that, and I've been trying to find ways to get it to showcase again to no avail. Ideally, and if you guys want to test it for yourself and let me know in the comments, that would be amazing, or in the Discord. But like, for example, on roads like this, it would be clear as day that anisotropic filtering was off, and then when you enabled it, you'd see the difference. But I just can't anymore, and I don't know if that's a bug from the wipe, or if that was just, you know, me. Ideally though, like I said, you should have it look like this if you have it forced on, and per texture might look maybe 20% worse, but be way better for those of you who are GPU bottlenecked, as it doesn't force a higher amount of sample collection for anisotropic filtering when it's at these oblique angles, or angles that are not facing the camera. But yeah, I would showcase it more, but as you can see from what I tried to find, I still can't find a difference. I'll update the pinned comment though if something changes with this. Nvidia Reflex low latency obviously is for reducing latency, but if you didn't know, it does this by syncing up the work that the GPU and CPU do, so that when the CPU is done with making a workload for the graphics card instantly takes it, renders it, and then pushes the frame to your display. On plus boost tightens up those timings so that they're synced even more closely together, and for extremely heavily CPU bottleneck scenarios where your GPU is way below 100%, it attempts to keep your clocks higher in on plus boost. So if you're in one of those scenarios, it might be good to run on plus boost, but otherwise, most of you should run on. It is worth noting that last wipe, there was a bug for a considerable amount of time that drastically reduced your performance when having Nvidia Reflex low latency enabled. It reared its head, I think, 2 or 3 raids after you started playing, so if you're playing for a while, then all of a sudden that bug would pop up until you disabled Reflex. As far as I know, that is no longer in the game, but if you're experiencing drastically lower performance than what you expect, go in here and try disabling Reflex and see if that was the cause for it to be abnormal. Odds are it shouldn't, because I don't think it's a bug anymore and I haven't experienced it, but it's always good to keep an eye out because it has resurfaced twice already, so it's good to keep an eye out for this. Sharpness is your personal preference. Feel free to set this to whatever you'd like. And then these all down here I would have disabled. So Z-blur I would have disabled, chromatic aberrations disabled, noise disabled, and grass shadows, though it can help you see some people in grass because it adds a little bit of shadowing and varies the color pretty much. It's personal preference, and if you do run it and you are GPU bottlenecked like me, then you will experience some additional performance loss with grass shadows, as it's just more shadows you have to cast. MIP Streaming, which I've made a ton of videos about already, is still broken. Please don't use it. I tested it on streets and it looked... Actually, let me show you. Screw it. It looked like this. Please don't. don't use it. Like, everything is just mush. So just right now, I've tried to get it to work properly, but on streets, if it's still not working properly on streets, which is where most people would use it to reduce VRAM usage, I wouldn't even bother. I wouldn't even bother. And it does slightly impact your performance if you are CPU bottlenecked, which is the majority of people. So I still just don't think it's worth it in any regard right now, unless you have a specific circumstance where it is beneficial. Otherwise, if you don't know that, leave that off. Streets of Tarkov lower texture res we already talked about, which leaves high quality color. I did get a couple comparison screenshots with high quality color that I am going to pull up right now, but honestly, it's really hard actually to see the difference. So I have off on the left and on the right, and what this is supposed to do is to improve the smoothness of different lighting or color variants as they get darker or brighter. So it reduces how sharp those gradients are. Sometimes, and it's easiest to see with flashlights, you can see like rings of color that basically go and don't really have much of a gradient in between them, but this should help smooth those out so it's not as harsh in between each one. There wasn't much of a performance impact when I last tested this, so it's personal preference if you see an improvement, even though it's very, very hard to really see it. In the occasions where it can help you, then I would run it on. If you notice any abnormal performance though, obviously leave it off and then also call me. With that though, it's time to move to PostFX, and I've talked about these. I have a bunch of videos on this, but the only settings that affect performance, which I will pull up here so it's on the top right, is clarity. If your GPU bottlenecked, as you can see, when I enable clarity to any value except 0, it will reduce my frame rate when I'm GPU bound. And the same thing will happen when I enable adaptive sharpen. So you can see we're at 113, 111, 112, and the second I enable it, we're going to dip below 110. Both of these settings do impact your GPU bound performance. So if you're trying to aim for the best GPU bound performance, then you would want to disable clarity and adaptive sharp. Otherwise, if you are heavily CPU bottlenecked and you don't have GPU usage at 100%, you can play with these however you want. If you do, just avoid clarity and adaptive sharpen, and the other ones you could still use. Last but not least is binaural audio. I know with all the audio changes, people might be concerned that this might have a more drastic performance impact, but when I benchmarked it on a CPU-bound Streets offline run, it was maybe 3%, if that difference. So it's really still up to personal preference, and I would 100% run this if you find that audio is way easier to track with it on. Hey, editor me here. I forgot to show you guys what setting profiles I would recommend based on if your CPU bottlenecked, my personal settings, or if your GPU bottlenecked. So I'm going to show those to you right now. What are my settings right now? So these are my game settings right here. And then this is my graphics. For reference, sometimes I will change to DLSS quality if I would like a performance boost, since for a good portion of the time I am GPU bottlenecked with my 3070 Ti. These are my PostFX. I skipped clarity and adaptive sharpen because of the things that I just mentioned, and then I run binaural audio. If you're trying to optimize for a CPU bottlenecked scenario, I would lower object LOD quality to as low as you can stand, and then pretty much pray. I mean, that's really all you can do for CPU bottlenecks. Other stuff you're going to have to do outside of the game. And since your CPU bottlenecked, you could then push up stuff like max performance and push that to a higher value, push up SSR to a higher value. You could use clarity and adaptive sharpen, things like that. However, if you're GPU bottlenecked like I am, then you may want to go a bit lighter on settings. For example, maybe skip out on HBAO entirely, depending on your performance bracket, ditch clarity and adaptive sharpen, and then you would be set. Obviously, if you're GPU bottlenecked, then you can also use upscalers like I do, depending on what graphics card you have and what your preference is to get additional performance. I'm going to let previous me take it out, just so I don't have to record anything else, because it's getting a little bit late, and this render is going to take like probably an hour and a half, if not more. So I need to get to this, but yeah. But with that, that is everything. Like I said at the beginning, this was a re-recording, so I had about 75 minutes of footage that I recorded for the first one, and I realized my audio was completely screwed up, so I had to do it again. Hopefully this helps you guys with your Tarkov settings, and if it did, you know what to do. This took quite a while to get out, so yeah, sorry for the wait, but it's here. I hope it helped you, and please join my Discord. or ask me on stream if you have any questions whatsoever. But for now, enjoy the new wipe, and I'll see you guys in the streams. This is Clem, clocking out. Later.